In our last session, we took some time to examine pessimistic existentialism, particularly as it is found in Friedrich Nietzsche. And with the time that we have today, I'm going to have to condense and break some of the promises that I made in our previous session, in particular considering Martin Heidegger's work entitled Being in Time. And so I would just commend that work to you and hope that you get as much enjoyment out of it as I have. I do anticipate other times during this series that we will discuss that work nonetheless. However, I also said that we would discuss men like Jean-Paul Sartre. And again, in the brief time that we have, we simply don't. And so what I do want to say is, as I mentioned in our last session, that existentialism essentially sees mankind through his passions, through his feelings. And Sartre said that man, which is very fascinating because it's ironic that he used this, but he used it on purpose because remember, he said there is no such thing as mankind. There are only men and women. Yet he says man is a useless passion. And simply put, what he means by this is life is but a cosmic joke, and the impersonal, apathetic, cold universe is its comedian. It would be preferable if the universe were hostile. That way we could appease the universe and so on, but as it is utterly careless, apathetic, and void. And so thus, man, even finding his passion in this existentialism, is utterly futile. And Albert Camus, who was also an existentialist, working out this pessimistic existentialism, said, the only question left now, really for the philosopher, is the question of suicide. Now, obviously the subject of suicide is quite a tender one, and so I'm obviously not advocating anything of the sort, and anyone who is suffering with that, as we know, there is that hotline to call 988 to talk you out of this or to help you through this. But I do have to say at this point that this is logically consistent. Simply put, where Nietzsche said that life is meaningless. He embraced the fact that life is meaningless. Therefore, we are to have this dialectical courage. Camus' solution or conclusion ultimately is, why? Why, if we were supposed to have this dialectical courage through which to embrace the meaninglessness of life, then why not have the courage to end it anyway? If we're going to the nothing, to the blackness, to the void, might as well muster up the courage to get there swiftly. Hemingway, I believe, suffered through this same ideology. And so therein lies the inevitable ramifications of pessimistic existentialism, whereas we want to take a little bit of time to consider the Danish gadfly, the Christian existentialist Søren Kierkegaard. He's referred to as the father of modern existentialism. And we remember that he's called the gadfly, the Danish gadfly. Coming from Denmark, he is the Danish gadfly, whereas Socrates was the gadfly of Athens. And Socrates exclaimed, "Know thyself." He, being the gadfly that he was, continued to go to the market to engage the people, to engage individual men and women out of their ignorance, out of just living this life and just existing and passing through and just watching life as life goes by. He called people to engage with life, to live, to find themselves and to find life. So Søren Kierkegaard really loved Socrates for much of the same reason I love Socrates. I love Socrates the man. less of the Platonism coming through from his disciple who wrote all of these dialogues. I really appreciate Socrates the man. And so Kierkegaard, much more than merely communicating his faith, he lived his faith. And we will speak about what I introduced last week in his book, Fear and Trembling, considering this subject, fear and trembling, through our patriarch Abraham. But he related to this through a lost love of his named Regina Olsen. They were engaged. They were engaged to be wed, and he called it off. He all of a suddenly called it off. And for this and other reasons, our psychoanalysis of our day likes to look back and proclaim that he had some sort of mental incapacity, some neurosis. But he actually explains why he called this off. Essentially, he was called to bring the people to the passionate life of Christianity. He was not merely interested in declaring what Christianity was to be. He wanted to show and to declare how it is to be lived. Not so much what is Christianity, but what does it mean to be Christian? Okay. And he said it was intelligence. In his journal, he says, it was intelligence. It was intelligence and nothing else that had to be opposed. Presumably, that is why I, who had the job, was armed with an immense intelligence. Kierkegaard came on the scene with rationalism, the philosophy of rationalism, very widespread. Rationalism is an extreme form of rationality. Simply put, you lose the object. You lose the existence of the object. Simply put, okay? Immanuel Kant gave the illustration of the $100. Okay, you have $100. You have an idea of $100 and you have the reality of $100. And these basically shouldn't be all that different. In other words, the content, what makes the $100 doesn't change whether I have the idea of it or whether it's real. So he would say the existence of an object is fairly superfluous. We can't know about the fact that the object exists doesn't tell us anything about the object. And so this rationalism, Kierkegaard came on the scene and said, well, in philosophy, when we're considering from the outside perspective what it means to be human and so on, we are losing the human in classification, in the scientific method. You know, we induce certain hypotheses and we perform our experiments from which we deduce certain conclusions and so on. And this is much how we have surmised and studied mankind. And Kierkegaard made the wise and astute point that we are losing the object and the man and the woman when we do such a thing as this. Now, again, in the time that we have, I want to illustrate through what he referred to as the three stadia of life, what he's essentially pointing mankind to, the kind of life man is to have. So these three stadia is merely the plural form of a stadium. Okay, I mean, we go to a stadium for a certain event. Maybe it's a sporting event, maybe it's a concert, and so on. So these three stadia, they're also referred to as stages, are the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. Okay, so first you begin at the stage of the aesthetic. And this is basically the stage or the stadium of the spectator, the one who merely watches life, who merely watches it go by, doesn't participate, doesn't engage. It's kind of fascinating where Hamlet says life is but a shadow, a poor player who struts and frets his hour upon the stage and is heard no more. It's a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Whereas Kierkegaard is saying, we're not even actors on the stage. At this level, We are just watching it go by. Now, he doesn't reject this level. Let me just say that at the outset. So I have to be as brief as I can about this. So the ascetic, essentially, is the one who merely sees. And in so making this a point, he illustrates the fact that all these rationalists, even Plato, Leibniz, Spinoza, Locke, and so on, were merely aesthetes. They were just watching. They didn't engage. They, as philosophers, were merely professors and not possessors of their philosophy. So, but the next stage is the ethical. And Kierkegaard argued that essentially when you embrace merely the aesthetic stage or the aesthetic stadium, you have subconsciously embraced the ethical, okay? Because when you so choose to merely be a spectator of life, this is an ethical decision. In other words, even if you have a worldview in which everything is meaningless and so you just want to watch and not participate, this is an ethical decision, okay? Now, the way he really illustrates the ethical, you have to understand these stages, these stadiums, these stadia aren't necessarily levels through which you pass from one to the next while leaving the other behind. In other words, you start at the aesthetic, you move into the ethical, taking the aesthetic with you, and then you take the ethical and the aesthetic into the religious. But he referred to the ethical stadium and the religious stadium kind of interchangeably. He would speak much of the ethical religion, basically. So ethics and religion. Because ultimately, if there is no meaning, if there is no God, why have an ethical framework at all? If all that exists is the hic et nunc, is the here and the now, there is no yesterday, there is no tomorrow, there is no great beyond, there is no purpose, there is no meaning, then why? Why even have any sort of framework of good and evil? So essentially the ethical moves into the religious. Now this religious stage, for Kierkegaard, how he illustrated this was through his book entitled Fear and Trembling, when he is considering our patriarch Abraham, when he is commanded by God to take his son, whom he loved, and take him to the place where God is calling him, and to sacrifice his son Isaac. And the Bible says, this is in chapter 22 of the book of Genesis, in verse 3, Kierkegaard makes much of the point that the Bible says, and Abraham rose early in the morning. And Kierkegaard wonders much about this. First of all, the whole command thing, this seems to be a contradiction from God himself. He's commanding me to do something that he forbids. So this is an existential crisis. But the fact that the Bible says that he rose early in the morning to begin his journey to sacrifice Isaac, Kierkegaard wonders, somewhat sarcastically, not truly, but he wonders, is this illustrating the profound faith of Abraham? Was he just altogether willing and ready to obey God through this immensity of faith, this great saint for the Christian, this father of the faith, and so on? Was this the reason? Kierkegaard says no. No, he surmised that the reason Abraham arose early in the morning was because Abraham couldn't sleep. He was tossing and turning during the dark night of the soul. So ultimately, the way Abraham was to come to this obedience was through what Kierkegaard calls a leap of faith. Now, the leap of faith from Kierkegaard isn't irrational, but it is embracing the paradox, okay? essentially, in ethics, and this is where I agree with existentialism, when you are in the dark night of the soul, when you are left on your own in the darkness, the common ethics, the collective ethics will do you no good. It doesn't do you any good to have some theory of ethics when you are suffering. So Abraham, sees this paradox. He finds this paradoxical, altogether paradoxical, and he embraces through his faith in the one who is absolutely faithful. He doesn't consider, well, I'm just going to leap in and hope that God is there to save me and that he's going to figure it out. He's understanding that here's a paradox. On the one hand, God is commanding me to do something but on the other hand, which is absolutely unthinkable, unimaginable. But since this is a command by God, I am going to embrace this paradox. And Kierkegaard makes the point that the Christian life is found in a faith in one who is a living paradox. Christ is the intersection between the eternal and the temporal, between the unconditional and the conditioned. So we also, our faith is grounded in a paradox, not a contradiction. Now, Kierkegaard is more well known because of his idea regarding the subjectivity of truth. He once said that truth is subjectivity. Now, what he meant by that has been debated ad nauseum and will likely continue to be debated. Was he saying that truth is merely subjected until the individual human man or woman embraces the truth and finds the truth and comes to the truth, and in that way it is subjective? Or, as many of his disciples would conclude, like Karl Barth and Emil Brunner, does this mean that truth itself is reduced to preferences, to the subjective preferences of each individual? I believe the former. Faith necessitates content, and this philosophy would be no philosophy without any content. So the subjectivity of truth, how I see coming through Kierkegaard, is this life of the paradox. When we individually come to the fork in the road, this reminds me of Alice in Wonderland. Sorry, when Alice comes to the fork in the road and there's a Cheshire cat and she, she's asking him, hey, which way should I go? And Cheshire cat asks, well, that depends. Where are you going? She said, I don't know. So the Cheshire cat gives that little evil grin and says, well, then it doesn't matter, ultimately. But in real life, when we come into this fork in the road, this paradox, this existential crisis, what Kierkegaard is saying is we don't leave off our minds. We don't irrationally leap into the darkness and hope God works it out. We follow our conscience, which is seared with his name. And so we do take this walk. We do choose which path to follow, trusting that God will still and ever will be the light unto our path, and so on. So this is the legacy of Kierkegaard as I find him, that I believe, through him, systematic theology was given something of a jaundiced eye. People find it fairly speculative, and they don't love systematic theology for many reasons I don't want to get into. But I am a firm believer that truth and Christianity must be coherent. It must be intelligible. It must be rational. So I agree with the disciples of Kierkegaard, and I'm sure Kierkegaard would say this himself. Christianity is more than merely rational. To that I say yes and amen, but with the provision, it is not less than rational. Yes, Christianity is more than rationality and so on, but it is not less. Jesus gave the parable of the two houses. Two men are building houses, right? He says, he who hears my words and does them, I will liken him to a wise man who builds his house upon a rock. Then the wind blows, a storm comes, rain rages, and so on. And that house stood, for it was built upon a rock. But the man who hears my words and does not do them, I will liken him to a foolish man who built his house on sand, and the storms came. The rain raged, and that house fell, and great was its fall. Here are two houses that are contiguous. I picture them in my mind right next to each other. They look exactly the same. You couldn't tell one is stronger than the other. And these are people. Let us not just think of houses. Let us think of the typical man or woman going to church. They're going through the ceremonies. They are being Christian, right? They're going to Wednesday services. They're feeding the poor. They're visiting the sick. Both of them are doing this. And then, all of a sudden, an existential crisis emerges. A storm begins to rage. And he who did not consider, who did not live Jesus' words, will fall. And great and tragic is his fall. The one who hears the content, who hears the words of Jesus and does them, is fixed upon the rock of ages and thus will never fall. So, again, the content is essential. And this dark night of the soul, again, when we embrace this paradox, is essentially the moment, the existential moment of faith. So, he considered this a moment, whereas if you think about a point on a line that reflects space, a moment in time considers, it reflects, it represents a duration, but without a fixed duration. In other words, this moment isn't fleeting. This faith continues. It begins with this paradox and continues sometimes being paradoxical. But it continues in this faith being fixed upon the rock of ages. And so, for my part, I really do not like considering myself or talking about myself, but I can almost not help it in this regard. The faith for the Christian, I believe to be monergistic. I believe God does come somewhat paradoxically, but he makes us willing in the day of his power. And I remember, I perused all these philosophies because the last thing I wanted to be was a Christian. And considering Camus and Sartre and Nietzsche and all the rest, Kierkegaard was something of a safe haven for me. I mean, all of this meaningless and so on was somewhat curbed through Kierkegaard. But it was really through Augustine's Confessions, book 12, chapter 8, when he refers to God's divine imperative or divine fiat, that truly caused great fear and great trembling, but a peace so paradoxical, quite paradoxical. And I definitely, along my Christian pilgrimage, found myself in quite a dark night of the soul where I didn't want to be a Christian anymore. So Kierkegaard compared himself somewhat with our patriarch Abraham. He also compared himself to Job. If we remember, Job says, "Though he slay me, yet will I trust him." And even through all of the agony, all of the suffering of Job, God shows him, reveals to him truth, love, grace, mercy, kindness, all of the good nature of our God. But that's not so easy to embrace when you're truly in that dark night. And you do question things like suicide, but as in the Pilgrim's Progress, we know is not an option for the Christian. But like Job, basically, I was begging God to slay me. Please take me out of my misery and bring me home. But that was not according to his will. And he safely led me through that dark hour, that dark night of the soul. But I do wonder about the Christian who seems to have been always a Christian. He was raised a Christian. He or she was raised a Christian. They never had a dark night of the soul. I find this to be the extreme aesthetic, the one who is probably not a Christian. Dostoevsky wrote in his The Grand Inquisitor, basically the Inquisitor is like the Pope of Popes. He feeds the people. He takes care of all of the needs of the people, because he essentially saying these people are just sheep. So I want to comfort them so they don't have to worry about what life is, what meaning is, what Christianity is, so they can just live on believing that they're Christians while they are not. That's the other thing I agree with in existentialism. And this is something Kierkegaard prophesied, that eventually everything will be measured by the collective. All of truth will be predicated on what most people say, which is exactly where we find ourselves now. Nevertheless, this dark night of the soul, this paradoxical existentialism, is not to be embraced through a foolish, irrational leap into the darkness. That is no faith. That is credulity. And a credulity worse than that of Nietzsche, worse than that of Camus, worse than that of Sartre. So may we see this paradox, see the truth manifest in the utter paradox, the divine paradox, the God-man, the one who is vera homo, vera deus, very God and very man. Now, I want to conclude, and I promise I won't just continue to do this, but I love poems, and I read one in our last session from Francis Thompson entitled In No Strange Land. I want to read portions of one, probably my favorite poem. Again, I am a firm believer, certainly through my own experience, I can say that God truly tracked me down. And I love this poem, which is entitled The Hound of Heaven. And I want to read for you the beginning and the conclusion. But between these, just real quickly, God's continually chasing him down. He's running as fast as he can. So, I mean, it's a fairly long poem. Just want to give you kind of the beginning and the conclusion. So, The Hound of Heaven by Francis Thompson. I fled him down the nights and down the days. I fled him down the arches of the years. I fled him down the labyrinthian ways of my own mind, and in the midst of tears I hid from him, and under running laughter up vistaed hopes I sped, and shot precipitated adown titanic glooms of chasmed fears. From those strong feet that followed after, but with unhurrying chase and unperturbed pace, deliberate speed, majestic instancy, they beat, and a voice beat, more instant than the feet, which said, all things betray thee, who betrayest me. Then, to the conclusion. Now of that long pursuit comes on at hand the brute, that voice is round me like a bursting sea, and the voice speaks. And is thy earth so marred, shattered in shard on shard? Lo, all things fly thee, for thou fliest me. Strange, piteous, futile thing, wherefore should any set thee love apart, seeing none but I makes much of naught, he said, and human love needs human meriting. How hast thou merited of all man's clotted clay the dingiest clot? Alack, thou knowest not how little worthy of any love thou art. Whom wilt thou find to love ignoble thee? Save me, save only me. All which I took from thee I did but take, not for thy harms, but just that thou mightst seek it in my arms. All which thy child's mistake, fancies as lost, I have stored for thee at home. Rise, clasp my hand, and come. Halt by me that footfall. Is my gloom, after all, shade of his hand outstretched caressingly? Ah, fondest, blindest, weakest, I am he whom thou seekest. Thou dravest love from thee who dravest me. I love this part. And human love needs human meriting. It's so true. And then God is asking, how hast thou merited of all man's clotted clay, the dingiest clot? How little worthy of any love thou art! Whom wilt thou find to love ignobly or ignoble, save me? Save only me. I'm a firm believer that my dear wife Sarah loves me, and loves me for my own sake, and so on. I believe my sons love me, and I love them. But truly, truly, who loves us like he does? Who can possibly even have this kind of love that chases after, ever and always chases after? This voice, this footfall that continues to chase our fleeing selves. We run. We try to flee. We come to this dark night of the soul, and we just seek to cast ourselves into utter isolation and just beg God to slay us, to remove us from all of this angst, from all of this despair. And he comes and runs us down and says, who will you find to love ignoble thee? Save me. Save only me. He is that great fountain, so far and so apart from this nothingness and this futility and vanity of vanities, as the preacher decried, is the one who is and ever will be. I love the fact that the name of God is I am who I am. This, I think, should be embraced for the Christian. God says, I am who I am. Even so, let we say, I am, through he who is I am. We, individually as Christians, are called to be Christians. Not only understanding the doctrines and the creeds of Christianity. Again, I'm a firm believer that every Christian ought to know these things, and that these should be rational, that these things should be intellectual, these things should be intelligible. But once we know these creeds and confessions, once we know these doctrines, what other reaction is there but unbridled and unvarnished passion and love and care and affection for the God who is, not an arbitrary notion and understanding of who he is, but knowing him and knowing that he is in us and will always abide with us until he calls us home, until he takes us by the hand and says, it's time. Well done, thou good and faithful servant. Come, enter into my rest. Let us always and ever remember that Christianity is not based upon a God who is necessarily for us. He is altogether for us. But I'm reminded, of the commander who Joshua met with on the way to Jericho. Obviously, I believe it was a Christophany, and the angel of the Lord. And this commander has his sword drawn. And, Joshua's planning the battle and so on. And he looks up and sees this commander with his sword drawn. And he asks, understandably, the commander, are you for us or are you for our adversary? Are you for them? Are you for us? And the commander says, no. That's his answer. No. I firmly believe what the commander, what the angel of the Lord, what Christ himself is saying. Yes, I'm here for you. I love you. I laid down my life for you, but you are here for me. This is our purpose. This is our meaning. This is abundant life. to glorify God and enjoy Him forever, to find ourselves in the great I Am. May we understand and look to Him with reverence, but with utter passion, utter and convicted passion, a Christian passion, which will never fade. Hallowed be His name in all the earth, world without end.